Okay, so I think we'll begin. So welcome everyone to our next installment of the author conversation series for Lexington Books' book series, The Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society. I'm Michael Giovine. I'm Associate Professor of Anthropology at Westchester University in Pennsylvania and Director of our Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology, but I'm also the series editor for the Anthropology of Tourism, Heritage, Mobility, and Society. I just want to say a couple of words about the book series. First, all of these webinars are with authors and editors of books in the series. As the series title shows, it's about anthropology, but you don't have to be an anthropologist to publish in it, of course. You just have to kind of have that kind of anthropological or qualitative research sensitivity towards diversity and a holistic and comprehensive approach to scholarship. And this book is a wonderful, that we're going to talk about today, is really a wonderful example of that, where we have a very diverse group of contributors and editors to the series. So the series provides anthropologists and others in the social sciences and humanities with cutting edge and engaging research on the cultures of tourism. The series embraces anthropology's holistic and comprehensive approach to scholarship and is sensitive to the complex diversity of human expression. So please do check out our series website. Check out, you could write me at Lex Tourism, Lex Tourism, right there you can see on the screen, at gmail.com if you have questions. Yeah, we can get started. So the first thing, one other thing, of course. So this is in a series. There are a couple other webinars that are going to be coming up later on. The next one on December 10th is actually my own book, if it ever gets published, if I could finish all those corrections, but is about study abroad, which is another one of these really timely books, dealing with COVID, that I think we need to rethink a little bit, and the well-being of our students when they're studying abroad, as well as the people who are hosting them. We have around Valentine's Day, we have a really interesting book, Rethinking the Anthropology of Love and Tourism. And then later on, we're going to have capoeira with Sergio Gonzalez Varela, and hopefully he'll be doing some capoeira or something for us. And also talking about apprenticeship pilgrimage later on as well. But for today, let me take this off if I can. Oh, you know what? I wasn't even sharing the screen, was I? So it didn't even matter what I was showing you. But anyway, so today we have a really wonderful set of contributors and editors to the book Tourism and Wellness, Travel for the Good of All. Bryan Grimwood is Associate Professor and the current Associate Chair of Graduate Studies in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at the University of Waterloo. Heather Mair is a professor also in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at Waterloo. Kellee Caton is a professor of tourism at Thompson Rivers University in Canada. And so I know it's still dark there by you, but hopefully it'll get lighter as we go on. Meghan Muldoon is assistant professor in the School of Community Resources and Development at Arizona State, and is also located actually in Hong Kong at the HNU ASU Joint International Tourism College in Hainan, China. I'm sorry, not Hong Kong, sorry, in Hainan, China. So I think this is a great example of how we have a lot of different contributors in the book who are anthropologists and sociologists, critical theorists, everybody kind of under this rubric of critical tourism studies that are editing this book. So I guess we'll begin maybe by, I'm just going to throw it out there to any of you to answer here. But, the title of the book, and it's a very beautiful book, I have to say. So I'll be the Jimmy Fallon here and kind of hold it up. It's really a pretty kind of a book. The title of the book is Tourism and Wellness, Travel for the Good of All. All? You got to have that question mark there. What's that question mark mean? Is travel for the good of all? Why do you start with this question right in the title? I don't know, you want Bryan maybe or Heather to start as one of the... Oh, I'm sorry. So one other thing that I have to mention is that we're going to start sorry about that. We're going to start with a 30-minute, conversation. Then we'll open this up for questions as we have in the past. So for all of you listening, you're on a webinar, so you can't actually be seen or heard unless I make you a panelist. So like we've done in the past, please, if you see below, you're going to see a Q&A button down below. Write your question in the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring that Q&A as well. And when time comes for question and answer, I'll call you up and I'll make you a panelist. And somebody's already asked, can you hold up the book again? So this is the book. Thank you for having us. So there you go. Heather has it up too. So you're gonna have to unmute yourself when you talk. But Heather, why don't I throw it to you? Let's start with this question mark in the title. It's yeah, maybe that's what you were asking, right? Where's that question mark? So there's the question mark. Why are you starting the entire book with a question?
Okay, I think Bryan wants to speak too. So thanks, Michael. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks, everybody. I see 67 participants and the number's growing. So this is fantastic. It's fabulous to be invited to this forum and to have a chance to chat about the book. I think the question mark is just an indication of good tourism critical scholarship. Can we really make a definitive statement about the impacts of tourism, even for those of us who think carefully about the benefits of tourism? We always have to be careful about who is being missed, who's being left out, who may feel differential impacts from tourism activities. And so for those of us that would call ourselves critical scholars, we're always questioning, we're always asking, what are the impacts? Can we talk about tourism in a way that keeps alive the complexity of the experience, what it's like for communities to host events, who benefits is one of the key questions that I always take to my scholarship. And so the question mark is really inviting discussion and debate and attendance to the complexity of the impacts of tourism as a phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael, for welcoming us and bringing us into a conversation and revisiting some of the good stuff in this book. It's been at least a year since, I guess it's 2 years now since the book was published, right? So to revisit it and think through it, and especially given the context of what we're all living through with the COVID-19 pandemic, is pretty interesting. But I think for me, the question mark, it speaks to the sort of tensions that Heather flagged, but also I think the disproportionate focus on individual health and well-being that is contained within the tourism and wellness literature. And so one of the things we wanted to do with this book and with the conference that it was associated with was really question that and really situate the relationship between tourism and wellness within time, within place, within a set of power relations that we don't often see in the tourism wellness literature. So it's really calling into question, I think an aspect of that is calling into question the assumptions made that tourism, whether we're talking about spa tourism or other forms of wellness tourism, is fundamentally a good thing for individuals.
Yeah, certainly. So maybe we can go in two directions here, because one, we really have to start defining what wellness is, I think. But maybe let me just jump in and you talked about this as being something that comes out of a conference, although it is not like a conference proceedings or anything, but also that there's this tension, which I think is very palpable within the broader critical tourism discourses between, on the one hand, certain disciplines kind of do look at that individualism and do look at the kind of neoliberal market kind of focus towards tourism and kind of seeing it as a business, which it actually isn't, right? It's a collection of lots of different kinds of businesses, maybe, but a business sector. But on the other hand, people, especially a lot of like anthropologists and social scientists, are often very quick to criticize tourism, and we do have a focus on and a sensitivity towards not only diversity, but to descendant communities and indigenous communities and how they're disproportionately maybe affected negatively by tourism and things like that. And I see that you guys are all, professors in a very interdisciplinary or maybe post-disciplinary kind of field. You're not in an anthropology department or a business department or anything like that. So maybe talk a little bit, maybe, I don't know, Heather, and I guess, and Bryan again, maybe, but how did the book get started? What was this about the conference? And what were you trying to achieve there? I'm sorry, I'm throwing this to multiple people. I don't know.
I'll jump in. Okay, so it's a long story, and I won't take a whole lot of time. But basically, it all started at a conference in 2009, the first gathering of the critical tourism scholars in Dubrovnik, and that was an international gathering and a very small conference, like 45 or so people there. And that was the first time that I felt, as a critical scholar in the North American context, that I had met other people of like minds who were from all over the world, and we were all sitting across from one another. And you're right, a lot of us were in business schools or rec and leisure departments or something, and feeling maybe a little alone in our thinking. Not only were we tourism scholars, which is a fairly new and rare commodity, but also a critical tourism scholar, someone who's challenging the assumptions that underlie scholarship and tourism development. And so when I returned to Canada, and I attended a couple of conferences, and then Bryan and Kellee and some others were part of that conference group that met every 2 years, we wanted to do something in the North American space to, attract a different audience, to make sure people didn't have to take long haul flights, to try to locate the conversation in a North American school or a North American context. And so in order to do that, you have to get funding and you have to get support. And one of the ways to guarantee institutional support at Waterloo is to link tourism to something else that people can see as meaningful. And we are in the newly minted Faculty of Health. I think that we're just about to change our faculty name to the Faculty of Health. And so we're constantly being asked, what's the relationship between what you do and what the goals of the faculty are? And so while Bryan and I think, have thought a lot about wellness and health in the context of tourism, we wanted to make that connection very clear so that we would get institutional support, that people could sort of see how those ideas could play out when you think about health in relation to tourism. But then, of course, adding that critical connection with a question mark. So is this really beneficial to all? How can we make it better? How can we construct it differently? And so, departmental support, institutional support, and also maybe giving it a bit of a specific Waterloo flavor to link it to what we do at the university was important too. So that's sort of how it all gathered. But the desire for me was to create that support group of critical scholars, but to move it from Europe, where it was tricky for people to get to, into the North American context. We could attract students and a different kind of group of people. And I'm sure Kellee will have lots of insights in that process too, and Meghan as well, as we tried to move that experience into different parts of the planet so that we could attract more people and more scholars.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I was just going to throw to Kellee, the question that I didn't mention all your credentials, of course, but you are on the editorial board of the Annals of Tourism Research, which is it's probably the most revered, interdisciplinary tourism journal, as well as other kinds of journals that really, that bridge a lot of these different disciplines. You focus on Journal of Ecotourism on ethics and things like that. So do you see the same kind of a thing when even on the editorial boards of these journals and stuff?
The same kind of thing.
Like the same kind of dynamic, that you're getting these polls, or that you don't feel like maybe a critical approach. Is it endemic there or not?
I think it happens because I think that has been really nice about working with Annals is that they do take the kind of critical and qualitative side of research quite seriously. And so there is a place for that. But at the same time, it's amazing to me how often I will be, reviewing an article, and I will think that the editor assigned to the article was a complete mismatch in terms of just really not being able to appreciate the method or appreciate, maybe a more avant-garde approach than what they're used to. So I think there is still that kind of conservative element, not that anybody's not, trying to do the best they can, but, people do speak different languages sometimes within that kind of context as well. And so I think there is a strong need for critical voices.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, as a qualitative, as an ethnographer, of course, we always get a lot of times in these journals, we get, the reviewers are like, it's really a nice study, but it's just a narrative, it's not, where's the numbers?
Exactly.
And that's always kind of frustrating. I always try to empower when I review a lot for Annals and other journals, I'm always trying to empower those kinds of people that the authors that I get, like, don't worry about this, like try to, be in your discipline. But, you know, I think wellness is one of these holistic areas, of course, where you can bridge those gaps. And let me just follow up with Kellee a little bit, because I know that you had a hand in, as all of you did, in writing the introduction to this book. And I have to say, the introduction itself is something that I think could be just assigned to students. I think it really gives a very nice, holistic overview of what health and wellness is. And well-being, and of course that sometimes varies within disciplines. Although even if you look at like the World Health Organization, they have a very holistic definition. But maybe can you explain to everyone what well-being is, as you guys are treating it in this book, and then how does tourism factor?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the things we wanted to do with this book, first of all, was to not define well-being too narrowly. We wanted to be very open to the fact that there really are, you know, it's a plethora of definitions in the literature. If you look at the interdisciplinary literature on wellness, it's just, you know, all over the map in terms of how people are using this term. And we wanted to have room for that with our various chapter authors in the book. So if you look at that literature, there's kind of three major schools of thought. There are people who define wellness in terms of people's mental states, right? So in your mind, you know how your life is going, you know how you're feeling, you're the authority on that. It's a very subjective kind of perspective. We see a lot of that in the psychology literature, and a lot of, you know, surveys given to people to ask them questions about how they're feeling on the inside and how they're doing, and that's used as a proxy for well-being. Another approach is to say that it's about the fulfillment of your desires. So it's not so much about your particular mental state, but rather what if you're getting what you want. This is something that economists use a lot, right? That we can track people's preferences by how they spend their dollars, and that you know, it's not you know, so much about what's going on in our minds, but about getting the things that we want. And then there is, you know, if you turn gears completely, because both of those are very subjective, right? You know, I know what I want, I know, or I think I do, maybe I don't, and I know what's going on in my own mind, maybe I don't. But if you would turn gears completely and look at more an objective perspective, in sociology in particular, you see a lot of people arguing that well-being is about things being good or bad for people, regardless of whether people necessarily recognize that, right? So I might, I'll give a personal example. I drank way too much on the night of the first American election debate, the night that Donald Trump bloviated over Joe Biden for the entire evening. And it got under my skin so much. And before I knew what was happening, a little too much whiskey was down me. And it made my daughter a bit concerned. And so, you know, that might have been what I wanted in that moment, was freedom and escape from the bloviator. But what ended up happening was that I felt very embarrassed and stressed the next day that I had caused my daughter stress, right? So there are things that are bad for us, even when they feel good for us in the moment. So that more objective perspective. And obviously in sociology, you see all kinds of studies that look at different metrics of health, right, across populations. And, you know, are people in different socioeconomic classes doing differently in terms of their well-being, in terms of, you know, all kinds of different criteria, marriage, anxiety rates, drug use, whatever, right? So it's this very kind of in the aggregate look at well-being. And also philosophers like Martha Nussbaum really take this approach. I don't know if any of you in the audience are familiar with her position about the capabilities approach, which is the idea that to be well is really to be able to develop and use your human capabilities to their fullest. That is really how she looks at flourishing. And so she has kind of an objective list that she's put together that she argues is quite value laden. So when we talk about objective, we mean outside the mind of the person for whom we're saying they may or may not be well, but we don't necessarily mean just focusing on facts and not values. It's always very value laden, what kinds of things we would put on a list that would make people well. But she has her 10 capabilities that she thinks should be basic human rights that everyone should have supported. So there's that kind of work. But then the last thing I'll say is that what we really wanted to do, like I said, we wanted to keep things open, and we wanted to make room for our authors to fit in anywhere in this kind of landscape in the literature that they wanted to. But one thing that was really important to us is to recognize that the existing literature on well-being tends to be very individually centered. So this is what Bryan was saying earlier. It tends to be very, very much about the liberal individual as a figure. And so we wanted to really acknowledge that well-being also lies in relationships, in webs, and that this is a really important perspective. And there's been very interesting research done on that. We cite a book in our introduction, where a pair of scholars have spent 25 years looking at different determinants of well-being across societies and have found a really striking pattern that societies with less inequality do better at wellness, regardless of where an individual person falls on the, say, the socioeconomic ladder. They do better if they're in a more equal society than if they're in a less equal society. So that really tells us that how our fellow humans are doing really matters for how we're doing. And also, obviously, we're part of bigger relations than humanity. We're part of the planet, right? We're part of the more than human world. And there's a lot of research within psychology about how important that is to our well-being, that we live in a healthy ecology and that we are a positive part of that. So I think there's a lot of ways to look at it.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I always, when I teach health and well-being, which my students are starting to study right now in the intro to anthropology classes, but certainly, you know, we talk about this kind of holistic, this totality of not just biological, but also mental and social and emotional and spiritual well-being. So, you know, this kind of balance among all of these components. And of course, with that such a broad kind of definition, it seems like nobody can be totally well. I don't know. I mean, what do you kind of think about that? Is there a way to achieve a kind of a total well-being or a balance?
I think you're always moving within that space, right? Like, I don't know that that there is any perfect recipe, but I think that you're right, Michael, to acknowledge, you know, that within that kind of diversity, we may be doing really, really well on some fronts and not well on others. And I think, again, that's a great place for the question mark, right? In what ways are we well, and in what ways are we not? In what ways are the communities we tour well, and in what ways are they not? Because it's probably rarely that we can say, you know, something is completely good or bad in tourism. There's always a lot of gray area.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that even these kinds of definitions that we're talking about, even if we're transcending the individual, that this is a kind of a Western conception, or do you see maybe, you know, like Meghan and others who are Bryan, you know, working abroad in other areas of the world? Do you see these kinds of ideas of well-being being embraced by different indigenous communities, or I don't know? That's up. No.
Well, I mean, I'm hardly an expert, but certainly I would say from what I've learned from working in China with just the concept of Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism at the moment, and just that the concept of well-being is embedded more within with peace and balance, and much less individualism and much better for the society as a whole, but certainly a less conflictual approach to making things better, as opposed to establishing peace and maintaining peace in society. From what I understand, I'm barely an expert, but that's what I've learned so far in my experience in China.
Well, so how is tourism implicated here then? How you know, like we could say, for example, Meghan, you wrote about slum tourism, which I think is a really fascinating, it's a fascinating chapter, but it's a fascinating study. I mean, we have others who have written on it as well, Fabian Frenzel, other people who have really kind of gone into these different favelas and places. It's a kind of it's an interesting, it kind of illustrates everything that you're talking about here, because people are traveling, the slum tourists themselves are traveling to this kind of dark tourism site to see people who are sort of unwell in terms of in their ideas, you know, in terms of at least the economic and maybe, you know, in terms of ideas of crime and things like that. But I think also there's this idea of maybe empowerment by tourism development people in working on slum tourism, that says that, look, this is a way to give them well-being. And certainly my own research in a totally different area that has nothing to do with slum tourism, you know, I really focus on this kind of idea of tourism as a valorizing force more than an economic force, that if it's valorizing the people and their culture and their way of being, that it does present more well-being than just economics. You know, that people might still be, you know, socioeconomically poorer, but they're happier and they're, you know, and they're doing well that way. But of course, people are visiting with the expressed idea that we're looking at, you know, poor, and I'm not even saying economically, but those poor people. How does that shake out in your field site here?
Well, I would say certainly I came to my study with sort of a very quote unquote critical tourism lens, where I saw slum tourism as being very exploitative, and sort of this massive power imbalance that's enacted in this tourism encounter. And through my study, which was a qualitative study, in a very small 3 townships in South Africa, so I don't want to broaden this out to all of slum tourism. But what I did come away with, and Heather and I have written about this, was this sense that slum tourism was really helping to break down some of the racial barriers in South Africa, in that bringing sort of the white tourists into the townships, which are homogenized Black spaces. It's allowing people to encounter and to interact with one another in a way that wouldn't be possible otherwise in society. So where I came to my study with this lens that it was this exploitative, abusive practice, and that people would feel used and exhibited, I was very much turned around in my thinking in that sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know, one of the kind of interesting things about your chapters, you're also talking about how it impacted your own well-being, right? And maybe challenging, putting you in the discomfort zone. Tourism in general usually is this idea of putting you in the comfort zone, kind of this bubble where you can kind of safely engage with alterity and otherness and stuff like that. And research is sort of the same thing, because we have in the back of our minds when we're doing field work, well, we could just go back home if things get too bad. I had my first child in Italy, and we could go back home if it's weird. That was one thing that we were always saying, as my wife was nervous about having the baby. Well, we could always leave, right? But that's not the case for some people. So I imagine that weighed on you a lot. How did you deal with this?
Well, what my chapter in the book is about my blog, and how I used the blog very actively as a way to present that discomfort, and question that discomfort, and get feedback from others, and be really open about that. And one thing that my experience, because I lived with a family in the township while I was there, so I wasn't coming in and out of the township on a day-to-day basis as a tourist, but was very much living there as a tourist, and trying to sort of unpack how my identity as a white tourist was informing how people interacted with me, and shared information with me, and trusted me. Mm-hmm. And so the blog was a way for me to sort of question my own sort of white feminist Canadian centeredness in this space, and try to sort of figure out where that was going. And Bryan and Kellee and Heather were also obviously huge helps during that.
Sure. Yeah, but it's good to have that social balance, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing with psychology. My dad's a psychologist, so I knock, psychology all the time. But, but this idea that you need to, especially in our own culture of individualism, sometimes we just need to find somebody professional to talk to, because we need to replicate those social relations that we can't, express normally. So blog is kind of interesting, I think. Were you aware when you were writing the blog, were you aware of the audience, or were you writing it more as a psychotherapy kind of, kind of a thing? Would you have an audience in mind for that? Because I think this is a great idea for, especially now, a lot of our students too are dealing with well-being issues, being on Zoom all the time and having to do this stuff and managing. And I think some of them do this too, but where's the awareness in this?
Yeah, so I did definitely develop an awareness of writing for an audience, and started sort of writing my blog post in my head as I'm going about my day to day, to the point that I had to start keeping a separate private reflective journal, because I was reflecting for an audience for certain, but found a terrific community of travel scholars, or travel bloggers, who really sort of communicated with me on a regular basis through the blog, and being so far away and in such a different time zone too, it was an extra form of communication that sort of cut through the isolation a little bit in doing field work.
Sure. Does anybody want to add to it? I'm sorry not to direct it to somebody, but did other people have similar experiences doing field work? I know Bryan, for example, you're definitely, as all of you are, very big into social justice, issues, especially as it deals with tourism and mobility. Has that ever been a clash? Your own your own person being studying others?
Every day, yeah.
I do have to say that you're I did not read your bio started with a very self-reflexive, you are a settler colonist of British descent in Canada, so it's right there. It seems very obvious, but sorry, not to cut you off.
Yeah, know how my own positionality in relation to the time, place, the context in which I live are really quite important in terms of how I view the world, how I relate to others, how I engage in research with others, and how I represent that in my writing, for sure. Yeah. So actually, Kellee and I and a PhD student here, MK Stinson, have recently published a paper that looks at our plant neighbors, in a particular plant neighbor, to help us learn about our positionality. So rather than drawing on, looking for new ways to relate to the world and situate ourselves as settlers in North America, we look to common plantain as a guide, and as a plant neighbor, plant kin that will support our learning about some of these things. So yeah, these sort of issues around situated knowledge and partial perspectives and positionality are really quite intense in all of the research that I do. I try to prioritize that and share that with students and readers as well. Yeah.
Well, I think it's just really fascinating talking about your plant neighbors. And by plant, you actually mean a non-human plant, right? And so your chapter also talks about non-human neighbors, I guess, or non-humans in the social world of tourism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that chapter is based on the master's thesis work of Madison Taylor, who was graduated 3-4 years ago now, and so came out of that work. And Madison was really active in writing that chapter. Our colleague Carla Bullock was also involved in that chapter. Yeah, and that it's situated in Thailand. Madison was responsible for the field work and the research associated with that. So she drew on her lived experience traveling to Thailand and participating in volunteer tourism experiences with captive elephants. Mm-hmm. And then also doing some work with other volunteer tourists who had traveled to Thailand and to work with captive elephants.
Sure. And she was saying, though, which I think is really fascinating, and it's so different than a lot of the volunteerism research, that I read, that really this working with the captive elephants, right? These non-human actors, maybe there's some anthropomorphism going on there in the ideas of the tourist, but it seemed, she says that there was a greater sensitivity towards well-being of locals and non-human actors through that experience. Maybe because you're working with animals, you're working with the ultimate subaltern, people who can't speak, or things that can't speak and tell you what's going on.
Yeah. So there's like this a tendency to demonize the mahout caregivers of like the traditional folks that have worked with captive elephants in that context. And one of the things that came out of her research with volunteer tourism is this is started amplifying and articulating notions of care and compassion that expanded, that had something to do with like the human and non-human or more than human relationship, but also that extension of care and compassion also went towards recognition of human others. And so the cultural context in which the mahouts relationship with animals became something that these volunteer tourists, who were all women, all from Eurocentric Anglophone sort of countries, contexts, started identifying with, right, and started recognizing. And so these experiences had that capacity to facilitate care and compassion sort of on the human, more than human spectrum, but also within the human realm too.
Sure. And I mean, there is, you know, references to the fact that there's been critique of voluntourism. And maybe we can expand this a little bit. And I don't know if others, Meghan and Heather and Kellee, you know, voluntourism is often kind of criticized, though, of like bringing out these kind of privileged, mobile, you know, white, you know, typically Euro American people that to do this caregiving, right? To go to places where they have this idea that they don't have as good well-being, you know, and what happens is kind of you play out and replicate a lot of the structures that put them there in the first place. The wealthier, you know, there's this great not to. Now I'm digressing, but there's a great, I think it's an Instagram account, the Barbie Savior Instagram account. Have you seen this? It's hilarious. It's like little Barbie dolls that are made to criticize voluntourists in Africa and stuff with little dark Barbie dolls around or things, you know, because there is this idea that, you know, what we're doing is actually perpetuating some of the structures, the neoliberal, you know, market-based structures when you're there. And so I thought this was kind of interesting because it kind of pushes the boundaries and says, hey, you know, that's also simplistic.
I think I might defer to Kellee on this because she's written recently in relation to countering some of those critiques. But before I do, I think a couple things. Those critiques that you're flagging are really important and shouldn't be ignored. And members of the CTS, the Critical Tourism Studies Network, have been really produced some fantastic research that have articulated that. So those ideas are part of that. The CTS conversation, and something that we're alert to. But I think, you know, one of the I guess cautions is to not to accept those as universal or totalizing, right? Absolutely. So we need to be able to, even within the context of neoliberalism, we need to be able to identify seeds of wellness, right? And moments of care and moments of compassion, moments of relationality and knowing. Within those contexts to help disrupt them, right? So even like, you know, the Barbie dolls have something to offer here, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Kellee, what do you want to add to that?
Oh no, I think Bryan got it. I think that's really what it's about, is that in any kind of context, you're looking for those seeds of betterment, right? And I think Meghan really expressed that well, talking about slum tourism. And perhaps this is the only way that certain people are going to encounter each other because of the kinds of social stratification we have. And I think we can say the same thing about volunteer tourism, that, you know, there can still be encounters that are productive and there can be learning that happens, and it doesn't necessarily automatically happen. So what we have to think a lot more about is those individual instances and how we can do better programming so that the typically young people who participate in this kind of tourism can have a more of a knowledge building experience than they maybe sometimes have in the past.
Sure. I mean, I'm dealing with the same kind of thing with my book that's coming out on study abroad, because a lot of the similar kinds of themes go about, like, how do you create a quality educated experience, you know, for people when it's necessarily, you know, relatively short term, and things are actually getting shorter. Even in study abroad, it's not your 2-year grand tour anymore. It's like 2 months, you know, not even 2 months anymore, you know. So how do you have ideas of how, is it through education prior to going on the trip? Is it, you know, how does the programming work that can maybe make it a little more equitable?
I think you have to meet people where they're at. Oh, sorry. And then I'll pass it over to Heather. But this is actually the context I've looked at more in my own work. My dissertation back when I was a kid was about study abroad. And I think
no, you're going to review
what I, oh, perfect. So what I came to learn from that was that students start in all kinds of different places, right? There are students who have never left their home area. There are students who jet set around the world and take for granted that they can do that and come with immense wealth and privilege. There are students who are very cerebral, very academic oriented. There are students who are looking for a party opportunity, you know, looking for, but, you know, which that is a kind of a dismissive way to say that, really looking for freedom and looking for, you know, a different kind of way of cutting loose in the world than they've necessarily been able to at home. And so I guess I don't have any really on the ground strategies, and maybe Heather does, but I'm thinking that non-judgmentalism is a really huge part of it. I think a lot of the literature can be very, very judgmental, and you know, literature on study abroad, volunteerism, whatnot, right? These kids today. And I think it's really important to recognize that people start in a lot of different places. And so there's not going to be a one size fits all. But I think even the people who start in the most maybe difficult places to work with can still grow. And maybe they're not going to take the same thing from a study abroad experience as a type of student who already has really a self-consciousness of themselves in that space, who already feels sort of like a consumer of the other as they travel abroad. And there are those students, what I've seen in my research, but so not, you know, people aren't going to end up necessarily with the same messages that they take away, but everybody can grow. Yeah. So to me, that's a big part of it. I'll hand it over to Heather.
I think this is an excellent discussion. I love the idea of meeting people where they're at, and I totally agree. And I don't want to discount the impact of some of these experiences and trying to find ways to make them, you know, more meaningful and more about relationships and understanding. But I also don't want to lose sight of, you know, the climate component underneath all of this. So study abroad, trips abroad, travel abroad, long haul trips, volunteer tourism, they all have we all have to ask a foundational question. Do you need to cross an ocean to find yourself? You know, and I think we're in a position now where we need to think about other ways of reaching our nourishment or our flourishing that is not going to be completely destructive to our planet, the foundation. A lot of us have decided, you know, no more long haul flights, no more travel. And I feel sorry I've had travel experiences my whole life and I've benefited immensely from them. But I think we're in a position where we need to have a whole different conversation about finding ways to flourish and build those networks and communications and understandings that doesn't start with a, you know, hugely destructive trip on a plane.
No, absolutely.
So I don't want to lose that, right? There's a well-being component to that's underneath all of this that I think is also really, really, really essential.
I know I got to just plug my colleague, Jennifer Kaufman at James Madison University, because she works a lot on trying to make study abroad more sustainable. A lot of her own research is on how long do you have to be in the host country to balance out the carbon emissions, right, of traveling. Because if you're in Nairobi, for example, where the electricity might shut off every night, you're just not having as big a carbon footprint as you would if you're in, you know, Pennsylvania. And so how long do you offset that? So there's actual structural changes you could do, but also, like you said, rethinking, you know, can you get the same experience at home or doing more local trips, or do you need to do the grand tour, Rome, Florence, Venice on a trip, or can you stay, like I have my students, for 6 weeks in Perugia, walking around everywhere? At least that's, you know, lowering the impact than taking buses all around the country. You know, so there's lots of different ways to kind of think about that. I wanted to also maybe ask you, Heather, you know, we've been talking a lot about like beyond the environmental impacts, but the impacts of the host community. I mean, your book starts out with a really powerful talk about race and indigenous bodies. And also a lot of because I'm also conscious of time, so I'm going to try to put these questions together. But several of the chapters are really talking about the role of language, right? It seems kind of, in a way, if you're not studying this, you know, why language? But it comes up a lot of times, right? In chapter 2, it discusses the ways in which language is deployed for what's called cultural well-being and empowerment. Other chapters focus on kind of letting the subaltern speak, especially I'm thinking of, you know, visiting slave quarters and collecting and allowing the oral histories to emerge. What is the relationship? And some of the students actually have asked questions about this as well. What is the relationship between language and well-being and tourism, these three together?
Am I allowed to defer to my colleagues on this?
Sure.
I think I want to hear from Grimwood on this.
All right, Bryan, take it away.
That's interesting. I kind of wanted to hear from Mair on this. I think one of us has a encyclopedia chapter focused on this this question of language that came up just through some text message last week. So maybe I'll defer to her.
No.
Question, Michael.
What is the relationship between language and tourism and well-being? That's a good one. I need to think through that to come up with. I think part of it is enabling. Enabling within the context of historical and contemporary power relations, right? Like who has the authority to speak, who has the privilege to speak,
Right.
troubling that, what sort of knowledges are brought to the fore through those power relationships, which ones have been marginalized or erased. And so fostering language, I think fosters diversity of thought, fosters diversity of knowledge systems, fosters diversity of worldviews, and and fosters the sort of equity that Kellee was speaking to that earlier on around and the relationship between equity and wellness. So if tourism, enter tourism into that mix, if tourism enables a diversity of language, I think there's a diversity of perspectives, diversity of knowledges and worldviews that are fostered as a result as well.
Yeah. Others want to contribute? I know, for example, so one of the things there was in Venice, for example, which is classically over touristed, in some of these anti-tourism marches and things, they're holding banners in the dialect that nobody speaks anymore, or very few people really speak anymore. To me, that linguistically is showing us a form of empowerment, right? That we are here. This is the language. We want to underscore this, right? So often in tourism, and there's a great book on tourism and languaging, not in my series, but in Channel View's series, that really talks about this idea that really to be successful in the tourism sector, locals really have to be able to speak the language of the tourists, right? The international language. And to that, I've written on the fact that, because I was a tour operator before going to grad school, we have our own idiosyncratic language among tour operators that will show you that you're in the know. You have your own epistemic community, for example. And so, there is this idea, I think, of being disempowered if you're always having to speak in somebody else's tongue. And another book in our series on language and tourism in Vieques, in Puerto Rico, also kind of brings that up, that they are contesting the tourism development, second home tourism in particular, by using their own language, right? And saying, you need to talk to us. So I think that's where I was going with that. Also with like, just in terms of letting, oral histories come out. What's the role of soliciting oral histories? And how would we be able to get those alternative narratives to the tourists that have very little time and maybe interaction with the descendant communities? I don't know, Kellee, did you write something on this that you could?
That's coming in the future. So I have a lot of thinking to do. But no, I think you make a really good point about getting alternative narratives out to tourists. I know there's some work in Israel going on. I have a colleague, Yaniv Belhassan, in Israel, and I believe that he's looked into some of the narratives of shared space, right? Obviously, Israel and Palestine have very, very different narratives, and trying to make sure that tourists are not exposed to one and not the other. And yeah, no, I think it's, I hate referencing Heidegger because I just can't stand him, but I think, there is truth in that, we dwell in language. That is, how we experience the world. We don't have any direct unmediated access to the world that isn't through our symbolic systems. That's part of how we work as humans. And so I think as Bryan was saying, for some people to have the opportunity to to share that, and for other people to be, forced always, and like you were saying, Michael, forced always to communicate in the register of another group is a way that we don't empower people. And I know Keith Hollinshead also, I would highly recommend his work in terms of looking at different cosmologies around the world, right? And understanding that that tourism plays such a powerful role in people's ability to articulate their stories, to articulate their cosmological perspectives. And we lose that if we, package it all up and send everybody to the resort in Acapulco.
I think as a, for tourists as well, it's about learning to listen too, right? Learning to listen to the different languages of place. And I would include like the more than human languages in that too, right? Like the ways the earth is speaking, the way the animals, plants are speaking, and what we can learn from that. And so being open to difference and learning to recognize and listen to those differences is key.
Mm-hmm. Heather?
I now have something to say. Thank you, guys. Sparked some thinking. And when Kellee mentioned Keith Hollinshead, I smiled because he used to say, he probably still does, and this is about how we as researchers use words and language. He would say, you're using baby words to describe these hugely complicated, powerful forces that are going on. We need better words. And Keith is famous for like just squishing words together to make them make sense for him. And we have a PhD student who's defending on Friday who did research in Tibet. She's a Chinese woman, and the beauty of her thesis is that the English language, the way that English scholarship and tourism has developed, is just unable to capture the complexity of these other sorts of experiences. It's really a profound exploration and a critique of our scholarship and the words that we use to try to describe the things that we're finding around the world. And it's just such fantastic research. It's making me think more than I'd realized, I think, before I listened to what you were saying, Michael, about words and language. And I think our scholarship has a way to go in terms of how we talk about these things too.
I just saw something where it was like a graph, and like what kinds of language do you use for complicated things, uncomplicated things? Like you want to make sure it's simple enough even to make the complex understandable without being just jargony, but you also don't want to be really jargony for simple concepts, because then you're just BS, just blowing wind. But the other thing, that it's a fascinating study because it's true that our language can't capture everything. I mean, if anybody who speaks bilingual knows that you don't translate word for word, in your mind. And that we all think in our own languages. And so that changes, is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in anthropology, that language affects mental thinking, the mind and culture, just as the mind and culture affects language. That we use the language as our toolkit for making meaning of the world. If we have just 2 categories of gender, for example, we're going to see the world in 2 categories. If you have 3 categories, you'll see the world in 3. So I appreciate that, you're talking about, even in tourism development, that this is a challenge, especially because everyone's adopting a particular linguistic register, to deal with people and events and experiences that are maybe better captured and embraced in another linguistic register. I think it's really fascinating stuff. We're almost out of time. We have a question too, but I did want to just bring it to COVID, if I could, really quickly, because I've been promising in my marketing of this webinar, we're going to talk about COVID. And a lot of students have actually talked about this. This book was obviously written before COVID, right? And we're talking about the well-being of groups, especially when they're being put under pressures of over-tourism and marginalization. But then we're also seeing, and I see somebody has their hand up, Ryan has their hand up as well. But you're getting, there's a lot of pressures now that COVID is creating, almost at the opposite end of the spectrum. I mean, we have to remember that this pandemic was is kind of interesting because it became a pandemic from a virus or an outbreak precisely through the infrastructures of tourism. And it's also affected those peoples who were most enmeshed in tourism the most, because it is one of these organizations. So I don't know who wants to, I know everybody kind of wants to talk. I know Kellee wanted to talk about this too, but how does COVID play into this now? I don't know if you, we have some questions too. How has COVID played into, how has it changed maybe, or made you rethink some of the ideas in this book? Kellee, do you want to start it out?
Yeah, if I can get myself unmuted there. I think it's quite amazing to see the world start to have a rethink in the way that critical tourism scholars have been trying to have a rethink now for a decade and a half. Like, it's very, very interesting to me, suddenly for the CBC, to call me up for an interview about, does tourism have negative impacts? And it's like, no kidding. Yeah. Like, I think it's really, really nice for people to be able to have that opportunity to be more critical, to realize that going into each other's spaces isn't always helpful, that we aren't automatically welcome everywhere, even though we might feel that this is our leisure time, this is our opportunity to unwind, recharge our batteries. It can be very good for our own personal sense of well-being, that's not always something that's helpful to the places that we might go. I know here in BC, we've had several Indigenous communities that have put up official statements saying, please don't come and visit right now. It's not that we don't like you, it's that we are, trying to keep our population safe. And I think, it comes as a shock to the ears of people in British Columbia who are used to, for a very long time, we've had governments that have been very pro-economic development through tourism, that it's always a good thing that we're getting out into each other's spaces. And I think people are quite surprised to hear that their presence is not always the right thing at that particular time. So for me, as awful as the pandemic is, maybe one little silver lining is a more public awareness, right? To rethink the well-being of those who are in places that we take our leisure time, that we so often unthinkingly do what we think is best for us and not others.
Yeah, I know. But we also have to be sensitive maybe to the economic realities, as much as I'm not into talking about economics as much, but the economic realities of our hosts, I guess, that do count on us. I mean, we see this even in these over touristed places, such as Venice or others. Is there like a better way, Heather, to reset, if we're going to reset maybe?
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity. I was just reflecting. I read Freya's Higgins de Boyle's paper, the 2021, where she looks at the debates on Trinet, kind of the reform versus the
and I'm sure all the
encourage
flack she got on Trinet.
I'm sure she did. She's just such a brave scholar. But it makes me realize that we shouldn't forget that we're still in this game where economics is paramount, right? The policy discussions are always about jobs and economics, and it's going to be increasingly hard to say we have a chance to do tourism differently when the other side of the argument is, oh my gosh, people are out of work, we need to rejuvenate, we need everything open again. There's almost a morality and a value judgment to that, where how dare you tell us that we can't continue the way we were because our jobs are on the line. And that's the same discursive trap that we've always been in with tourism. And I worry it's going to be more intense. Yes, there's a pause. Yes, we have a chance to reframe. Yes, maybe the scholars among us are having a chance to get some of our messages out that we've been saying for 2 decades or more. But I fear that the kind of moral implication around all this to regenerate, to push that economic opportunity back is going to be hard to counter that, because the stakes will be framed as so high, right? Yeah. And that's, in Freya's paper, really kind of made me, I'm not on Trinet for my own mental health, and I just think that it's becoming a moral argument now, which is so risky for those of us who want to think about things a little differently. And it becomes, how dare you tell me in this community that I can't have tourism? Right. So I think there's a risk here.
There's a risk, I think, I think you brought up in the beginning, somebody brought it up in the very beginning about how we shouldn't make one giant umbrella, idea for any of this. Tourism is individually instantiated, in different communities. So maybe what's good for one community isn't good for another. And on both sides, I think, of the argument, there's this tendency, especially when you're moralizing, that these are universals. I was on a panel when the pandemic started, about, the future of well-being and COVID. And the panelist was saying, well, I think what's going to be good is that we're going to have less travelers. So it's not going to have as much pressure on the local community. But again, you have to look at then who's going to be traveling. It's going to be the wealthy, the more privileged people. And again, now you're looking at a different moralizing idea that now it's going to be for the rich again. Which is also something that's problematic. And this comes up also, Bryan, maybe bring you into the discussion here about in the environment, right? If less people can travel, then it would be okay. These less long haul flights like we're seeing now. COVID really brought out utopian thinking about the environment. I mean, we have all these news stories, most of them were like fake news, but dolphins in Venice, coming back, and being able to see the Himalayas from Delhi. And to me, regardless of the fact that they were factually inaccurate, they were revealing our implicit ideas that maybe all this travel is environmentally unsustainable, and we hope that things could get better. How do you see environmentally this coming out?
There's a great paper in the Tourism Geographies special issue by Emily Crosley, if I'm getting her name correct, that talks about this relationship and what she points out in she gets around the notion of whether the environmental response or the environmental health is factual or not, or fake news or whatever, gets around that by looking and identifying with the grief and the ecological anxiety that is communicated and conveyed. And so I think the relationship there in terms of like grief and mourning the sense of loss around connection with others, connections with places, is really kind of interesting, something that is new and innovative within the tourism realm, I think, and looking at these psychological effects of physical distancing and being more local. So, and in that paper, she also draws some connections to, how we might be responding or feeling in relation to environmental disasters associated with climate change and other environmental effects. So I think, like that, I'm curious about diving into like notions of mourning and ecological anxiety and grief and what comes out of that.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, Meghan, on the impacts of COVID on tourism, especially maybe in South Africa or something?
Well, just from a personal experience, I can say that I've had two individuals that worked with me on my research in South Africa reached out to me for a donation as a result of COVID, because they were having some economic losses, obviously. So tourism left them extremely vulnerable, especially because South Africa had such a hard lockdown, but at the same time had created a network that they could reach out to in that time of stress and ask for support. So a bit of a double-edged sword there. And I mean, I don't know what I can say about COVID that hasn't already been said in terms of the longer term implications and the longer term implications, the longer it lasts, right? Like, I feel like my conversations have changed to such a degree as a result of having been, I'm also living in a bit of an alternate universe as a result of COVID, whereas I think a lot of people are still in place. But I'm, I guess I'm very curious about the long-term implications and how this is going to change. And something that I discussed with, this is a little bit off the topic of tourism, but something that I discussed with another author in this book, Dominic Lapointe, was how
here, I think.
COVID is,
sorry,
I don't know. But this possibility that COVID is exacerbating the gap between well-established academics who are potentially a little bit older, maybe you're not caring for children in the home, so have this time to be writing and theorizing, whereas younger people, and especially women, are caring for children in the home and trying to maintain their careers at the same time. So it's actually exacerbating that gap in the academic community. Hi, Dominic. Do you want to add to that?
Dominic, I'm going to pull you up here because we're at the question answer time anyway. And so I do want to, so I'm making you a panelist. And then I'm also going to pull up Hyunseo Yoon, who had a question as well. But Dominic, do you want to add anything to this?
Hi, it's so nice to see you guys. Well, but then the screen make the absence so present at the same time. I know Meghan kind of resumed very well the discussion we had together about this thing, how, you know, that idea that we are equal in front of the viruses is totally false. You know, we're not equal facing the impacts in the academia, outside of the academia, as travelers, as mobile, immobile. The whole mobility distribution right now is totally reshaken, or like the cards are redealt in some ways, where some people were highly mobile will become even more mobiles, and there's all kind of like dialectics that are playing right now. So it's quite a fascinating time to do research, but also a scary time when we look at what's ahead of us. Yeah, right. And to go back to the book, that's an amazing book. And yeah, the introduction, like you were saying, it's, you know, I teach in a French environment, and you know, all the students who actually are comfortable reading English, as soon as they say the word wellness or well-being, or, you know, populations and positive impacts, I send them towards that introduction, you know, saying like, yeah, think about it, it goes beyond the jobs. So basically, and yeah, all of you.
Well, Violet had a question. I think that's a good follow-up. Are you, you want to pop on and ask your question?
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Nice to meet you guys. My question is just a simple, like, you know, how do you think about the relationship between tourism and leisure in terms of, you know, subjective well-being? Like, you know, there's a like dimension, like, you know, with leisure contribute to the level of well-being, but we are not sure tourism is like distinctive field from the leisure or not. But no, I'm wondering, how do you think about the relationship about this?
And I think we could add about in the COVID era too. I mean, how has it impacted the individual well-being in general? You know, anybody want to take that on?
You chickens. All right, I'll jump in. I think that's a great question. And I think we need to keep thinking about it. What Kellee did that I thought was so helpful at the beginning was really laid out the different ways that different kind of fields and disciplines think about well-being. And what we tried to do in the book was to really open that up and to think in a really complicated way about that. So the answer is, in good old academic terms, there is no definitive answer. I think the book in particular is an exploration about how we can think differently about wellness and well-being. And I think in COVID, I think it is forcing us to think about individual well-being, lack of travel, access to travel, lack of holidays, the need to, you know, mobility, all those kinds of things, but also watching places that were so heavily dependent on on tourism, exposing the vulnerability of tourism as an industry, as a mechanism for unequal opportunities for even economic development, and then unequal opportunities for achieving well-being for communities and individuals. So I think I'm not being definitive deliberately, and I think it's really about an exploration of thinking about those things.
You know, I want to bring Juliet in. Oh, sorry, Violet. Sure.
No, I just want to say, okay, thank you.
I know we're almost out of time. So, and I know Juliet actually should be in another class, but you had some really good questions in the Q&A. Are you still there?
Yeah, actually my class was optional today, so I didn't go. But okay, so I had two questions, and the first one was like the shorter one. You were talking about the relationship between like language well-being and tourism, I believe. And I know you were talking about the one Instagram account and like how like volunteer tourism gets a lot of criticism. So I was just wondering like what you guys think about, do you think that students should be required to at least familiarize themselves with the language of like the country or culture that they're intending on visiting, because like you've established that relationship between language and well-being and tourism? Do you think that that should be a requirement? Like maybe not become fluent in it in that matter of time, but at least try to familiarize yourself with like the language of the place that you intend to visit? I don't know if I should ask my second question right now or if I should like let it marinate.
Take on the first question first, I think.
Okay, cool.
Your second question, I liked too.
Thanks for your question, Juliet. I wish Dominic was back on here too, because it's maybe I could clarify this question with him as a Québécois man.
Still there.
Me being in Ontario, I've often wondered this when I travel across the provincial borders, and I guess Meghan's in Quebec right now too, right? In terms of I think I aspire to learn the cultures of the places I visit, but I've also been in Quebec. I have some very memorable experiences of Québécois being like not giving me any time with my French, and rather just like, you know what, don't bother, just speak English. So I've never been able to pinpoint that. I know there's a lot of diversity there, and a lot of where you are in Quebec matters. But yeah, I think for me, I think the ideal would be to at least try and attempt and show you care, and do your part in that. But
before Dominic talks, I want to follow up because he left, unfortunately, because we're over our time for our class. But one of our students, Carson, actually asked about now where was the question? It was about like how important is socialization, right? In learning for the tourist of learning the language. Do they, if they don't speak the language, do they feel their well-being is thrown off as well, just because they seem to not be able to connect in the same way? So this also goes with Violet's question about individuality here. The individual tourist, if they can't connect and they seek connection, what's going to happen? I don't know, Dominic, you want to take over?
Well, language is a huge issue, and to go with what Bryan is talking about, you'll have a different response in France, for instance. If you try to speak French or speaking English, well, if you try to speak French, probably they'll say they don't understand you in some places because they don't understand me sometimes. But also, every place have a special relationship with language, and what Bryan is saying about, and it's funny because there's that huge thing in Montreal about the bonjour, hi, which for half of the population is seen, and there was a survey about that, as French becoming less important, and for some other it's becoming more important. And it's really interesting how to see in the same society we have really 50-50 almost divide, where one side say that welcoming people in Montreal in the business where mostly, it's tourists, saying bonjour, it's acknowledging that we're speaking French, and hi, we welcome you. And some say, well, it's really good because it's marked the fact that here you speak French. But on the other side, you get the other half who are saying, no, that means it's opening up the conversation. So bonjour, but then speak English, we're there to give you services. And and even within that society, we have that that divergence of position according to language. And English, in Quebec is at the same time the language who actually, from before the Quiet Riot, and I don't want to open up into a history class, which, it's associated for some people to some kind of, of a colonial I would say, stranglehold. And on the other side is the language of the opening up to the rest of the planet. That was really, really important in '67 and moving on with the Quiet Riot in Quebec. So you have that, that tension that is always there. So then when you have someone like Bryan coming and trying its French, even if you want to try really hard, most people speak English will say, oh yeah, we're open to the world, so we'll speak in English with you. And I have a friend, if you can read my text in some of those books, is because I have a really good friend who's a geographer by training, but a translator, as a professional. She worked for the federal government. She's an English speaking lady who's lived, in France and in Quebec for many years. She has an amazing French with a tiny little accent. And one out of the two times when she go to the restaurants or the bar and she start to speak in French, people answer back to her in English because she have that little accent.
Oh, yeah.
So, it's that real complicated positionality with French, and every individual, negotiate with it in different ways. For my parents and my grandfathers, the English is the language of the boss. But for my daughters, it's the language of the world, but we all live together. So and we have to, and that brought in a very interesting perspective with the fact that when we study tourism from a social science perspective and a critical one, we don't talk that much about tourism. We're talking about society, and how tourism is a translation of society, or some kind of an indicator of society and societies in plural.
Absolutely.
Okay, much time.
Absolutely. And I should just add to what you said, that, there is also this hegemony, a little bit, linguistic hegemony, that to publish, right, Kellee and others, to publish, you got to have a really good handle on English. And so you get, more Northern European or Anglophone people who are able to write better in that language than, let's say, my colleagues in Italy or something like that, or somewhere else, who can't necessarily express themselves, and so they don't get out the impact factor, they don't get out to these giant journals. Meghan, do you want to add something? I'm sorry.
No, I think the only thing that I would add really briefly, I'm conscious of time, is that in my travel experiences, being a native English speaker and with what Dominic would describe as my 3 glasses of wine French, I've been able to sort of get along pretty well. I learned some Swahili and I learned some Hindi, and, they're very similar languages. And then I moved to China, and it gave me a whole new appreciation for the impact of colonialism, and how the lasting effects of colonialism has privileged Westerners to be able to travel to all these other parts of the world where those languages have really taken over. And then you go to a place that's had very minimal impact of colonialism, and it's very frustrating because I'm a functional illiterate. So I just wanted to touch on that very briefly, that's deeply embedded in our history, and again continues to privilege the Western traveler.
Sure. All right, so let's get Josh in. You're a linguistics student anyway, major, but I know you had a question about COVID as well, and then we'll get back to Juliet's, and then we'll end this thing.
Sure. Thank you. So you all had mentioned a little bit of the negative economic impacts of COVID within the tourist industry. So what I was curious about is within these tourist places, is there any, or that you guys see any sort of organized efforts to diversify the economy away from tourism a little bit, so that should this happen again, or how long will this pandemic last, sort of thing, where people are starting to really realize that maybe they need to find other sources within the economy?
So I'm just getting ready to start working with a museum in northern New Mexico. I grew up in New Mexico, and so it's a really exciting opportunity for me to kind of touch my home base. And they're a new museum. They just opened in 2019. So, and it's a small community. So what a moment, right? You open in 2019 and then boom, everything is shut down. And so they're trying really actively to explore the ways that they can get heritage narratives out into the world virtually. And they serve, you know, not only tourists, but also a lot of local schools, local people in the area, pueblos, which are indigenous settlements that date back to the Spanish colonization era. And so they have a lot of different kinds of communities that they serve, including tourists, and they're trying to figure out how can they tailor virtual opportunities to reach these different audiences so that people can still learn about heritage. So I think we're going to see some situations like that. I think that's also important, like Heather was saying, from a climate perspective. I think people are looking for more ways to engage with the world that don't involve so much carbon. So I do think that's one trend that we're going to see. I think a lot of people are also being more encouraged, I guess, to discover their local areas. We talk about staycation, right? And I've noticed a lot of businesses in British Columbia have been really trying that strategy of trying to get local people to come. And, Violet was talking about the line between leisure and tourism, and, can we see them together? And I think, can you be a tourist in your home community? Of course you can. If it's about a particular mindset, then that form of leisure is something that you can do at home, but still kind of see the world in new ways. So I think those are two big trends that I'm starting to see, at least in New Mexico and in British Columbia, where I'm working. Yeah. And I guess one other thing I'd add to that is just that we don't want to be too hasty to transition too much away from tourism either, because there are places like BC that have traditionally had a very strong resource extraction economy, right? And so we've tried very hard to move toward tourism so that we're not destroying the environment. And so it's tricky because you don't want to jump ship too quickly, because we finally started to get people on board that instead of logging and mining, perhaps we can get people walking in the forest.
Yeah. The first substantive chapter in the book by Emma Lee of Tabakuna country talks about how tourism doesn't matter to particular cultural livelihoods of these Basque fisher women in Spain. And so what she identifies in that is that the economies of tourism are ancillary at best, right? So when we're talking about wellness in the relationship with tourism, sometimes tourism just doesn't even factor into that equation, into that question, right? And so what she does in this chapter is really articulate how this sort of self-determined, autonomous sense of community and cultural livelihood is the pillar. And if tourism can support that, okay, but it's not going to threaten it, right? And so I think there's also resources and stories and narratives that are out there in the world that show how the pandemic has created some important change in community context, but it also hasn't really affected livelihoods. There's a nice or that the livelihoods have transitioned. There's a nice paper by Anna Carr in the Tourism Geographies special issues that talks about the impacts of COVID-19 on Indigenous communities, and there's a little narrative there about an Indigenous entrepreneur group, a couple who provides food servicing, and how they shifted and pivoted their practices to serve communities. So moving away from serving tourists to serving communities in sort of a food culinary tourism context. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Heather, did you want to add?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm trying to think about it, because when I was doing my doctoral research and up into my first years at Waterloo, it was really about making the argument that tourism was, in a lot of ways, kind of supply driven, for lack of a better word. It really was about places trying to hold up their hand and say, come see us, because there was that economic argument where everybody kind of wanted to attract that tourist dollar. And now I suspect we'll be heading into more of a consumer driven situation, where if communities have managed to figure out a way to survive if they were tourism oriented, and they're less so now for developing other economic opportunities and managing to kind of hold things together, what happens when tourists kind of show up and want to have those experiences, and the long haul flights and the mass tourism and the package tours start to come back? And so I think there'll be some interesting opportunities there to resist maybe the forums of tourism. And there was some neat reporting in our national newspaper around communities in Italy in particular that were sort of, locals were kind of coming up like gophers, sort of up out of the ground, looking around, and it was quiet, and they were going out and enjoying their community again. And there is an element of resistance to returning to normal again. But what happens when the flights return and the package bus tours return, and who decides, you know what, we don't want that now. We've decided that we can handle this in a different way. And to Kelly's point, we're in a capitalist neoliberal world, and you have to answer economic losses with economic opportunities. That's sort of it's the world that we're in. And so if it isn't tourism, what is it? And if tourism is an extractive industry in some ways, but if you compare it to logging and fishing and, industrial farming, but what kind of games are we playing here? So I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see once these things kick back in, and who gets to decide who becomes that destination again, and what kind of destination do they want to be? It's a good question. Thanks, Josh.
One of the I guess maybe this is tangential a little bit, but one of the hopeful things that come out of this is people being outdoors more, right? So parks and protected areas and camping in Ontario at least has been like the demand to get outside and be in those spaces with family, friends, physically distanced, of course, has been really popular, and it's been really difficult to find spots because they've been picked up and booked. But the use of urban park spaces for daily jogs or daily walks, the overnight camping facilities that are there, I think these are taking on some additional public health related importance, that there's a big literature about environments, natural places for our health and well-being. And one of the hopeful positive things that might come out of this is that maybe some investment in those sort of ecological infrastructures that support our health and well-being.
And unfortunately, Juliet just had to go, but this follows exactly to what Kellee and Heather and Bryan were saying about the kind of the ecological importance and also getting out into the world and everything. Juliet asked, I know you're talking about long haul flights and aiming to reduce carbon emissions, but can we really gain a workable understanding about well-being from doing research or travel in more of a local context? We talked a lot about the benefits of true ethnographic research and implementation of embodied participant research. So do you think we can still gain a reliable understanding of well-being even without travel? So I think to add to that, maybe travel in many different forms, including our own research, takes us out of our comfort zone or out of our own cultural context often. I mean, that's one of the reasons why people travel, even if it's domestically. It's this change of even the gaze that you're using to look at things. Can this occur without the far-reaching forms of mobility that is business as usual in tourism?
I'm going to say, why not? Why not? Maybe it's time to rethink this. I am open for new ways of thinking about all of this. We have convinced ourselves that we need to go to a place that we've never been before in order to find ourselves, or whatever that process is. And we can't learn unless we're physically immersed in a place. And we are in a situation where we have to really rethink all those things, because the how has been destructive. So why not rethink it, right? I remember sitting at a tourism meeting we had this whole session on the environment, and I remember thinking, none of us should physically have flown here to have a conversation about tourism impacts on the environment. Now I think we can rethink some of those things, right? That was 5 years ago. Now I think it's not perfect, but we can think about different ways to gather, to talk, and to learn. And I would have poo-pooed a visual video conference 5 years ago and thought that's not really engaging and learning, but maybe it is. Like, why not? Why can't we rethink these things? Mm-hmm. That's, I don't have a good answer, but I refuse to stop asking.
Absolutely.
I like that answer too. I think why not? And then like the opportunity to root in place and sort of and seed some ideas or notions of wellness there, or notions of what tourism could be and what travel could be, right? So there's nice group of folks in based out of the University of Lapland, and Outi Rentala and her group doing some work on proximity tourism. Emily Hawkhart is involved in that as well, but and sort of exploring this notion of proximity tourism in the context of the Anthropocene, but that's taken on this additional like intensity with the pandemic. But I wish Julia was still here, because I want to dissect her question with some of these notions around like what is true ethnographic research and what do we mean by reliable understanding. And so like these are like some of the methodological sort of questions or philosophy of science sort of questions that our CTS network is starts drooling over. So
watching this, she said she'll watch the answer to her question.
Yeah. So I kind of want to ask get some clarity on in terms of some of the assumptions that are underlying the question, and try to understand what some of the phrasing means in terms of what the question's about. So
Sure. Well, I'm the professor teaching her that stuff, so I guess no, but I don't want to even go into that because we are out of time. And I really appreciate it. Did anybody else want to say any last words? Kellee or Meghan?
I'm just going to jump in and say, I think I'm kind of the black sheep in the critical tourism family in this regard, but like, I think the visceral still is really, really, really important. And I think visceral interaction with people and places that are distant from us is also important in addition to rooting in place. And so the basket that I'm putting my eggs of hope in is for cleaner energy sources, right? Because like Heather said, we can't keep doing things the way we're doing things. The how is broken, but I think the what is not necessarily a bad thing. Certainly the way tourism plays out can be completely horrible. I don't think anyone would advocate for, things like the giant cruise ships that dump out all over Venice. And, I think that's made Venetians pretty miserable. But, in terms of just being able to take your body elsewhere in the world and interact with people, and even from an epistemic perspective, right? For me, being able to work with my colleagues around the world, like my soul is starving because we're all stuck in these little Hollywood Squares boxes, and I can't stand it. I want to hug you guys. Like, this isn't working for me, and I want to, go and have a drink and have a conversation and get new ideas that I've not thought about before. So I think I still recognize a lot of value in that. And I think it's something that we need to fight for. And so we need to fight for energy sources that make sense so that we can continue to do things that we value.
Teleportation.
Yeah. Well, maybe with that, Meghan, did you want to add anything?
I did have one thought is that some of the work that's being done by Bryan and by Kellee's colleague, Lisa Cook at Thompson Rivers, has been sort of the local tourist and doing some interrogation of our own systems and our own interactions with people in our local tourism places, and especially in the Canadian context and the settler Indigenous context. So I think that there's definitely a way to be an ethnographer locally and to sort of challenge your own understandings of your own home space. But to Kellee's point, that the greatest joys in my life have been hugging you guys in all kinds of different wonderful places, and doing my research in other spaces. So I don't want to take away, because I think Kellee made this a very fantastic statement. I can't add to that, but just want to second that there's got to be a better way. And I think this provides us with a real, we've been saying for years, we need to do this differently. How do we, what's the tipping point? How do we start this change? And this is the moment. So whatever we can do to take advantage of that, we're in that space.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think this is an excellent way to end. I want to thank everybody. We're going to be stuck in these Hollywood Squares for, I think, a little while longer. So please continue to zoom into these webinars when they come up. But I really thank you once again, everyone, Bryan and Heather and Meghan and Kellee. Fantastic conversation and a really fantastic book that is really wide ranging. So I wish you a lot of luck and thanks so much for being here.
Well,
thanks to you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael, for hosting us today, and
awesome
for pulling together this book series that we're part of, and happy to be a part of with Lexington. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.